Hi everyone. Moving on in our discussion of European overseas expansion, today's topic is Portugal's initial ascendancy. Historians have long wondered why tiny Portugal led the way in overseas expansion. Portugal in the late medieval and early modern period was one of Europe's least populated and least developed kingdoms. But a closer look at several key factors helps to solve this puzzle. First, the Kingdom of Portugal was an ancient maritime crossroads straddling two commercial spheres. These are the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic. Coastal shipping had grown efficient in the late Middle Ages. By contrast, overland transport between northern and southern Europe remained slow, costly, and vulnerable to bandits. Well before 1400, long-distance merchants had put into port at Portugal's capital of Lisbon to break up these long journeys. They came from as far away as Venice and Stockholm. Commercial competition was also fostered by Portugal's kings. Money, exotic goods, shipbuilding, and sailing knowledge were all traded. Money, ships, and goods all accumulated in the hands of merchants, many of whom were foreign. Second, by the 1430s, fishermen regularly ventured far out into the Atlantic in pursuit of better catches. At the same time, arable land grew scarce in Portugal due to population growth and the expansion of large landed estates. As a result, overseas colonization became increasingly attractive. Third, religious and strategic concerns drove Portuguese nobles to capture the Islamic port city of Ceuta on Morocco's Mediterranean coast in 1415. Now, I just want to comment here. This looks a tiny bit misleading. But if you remember, there's a little bit of Africa that pooches up to the north. Ceuta is right on that promontory, right out into near the Straits of Gibraltar. Crusade-like ventures in a similar vein to the capture of Ceuta continued to overlap with commercial interests throughout the early modern period. As a result, the push of limited resources at home and the pull of opportunities abroad stimulated Portuguese expansion. With support from ambitious nobles, Portuguese and foreign investors pooled their capital that they had accumulated in shipping and money lending. Nobles like Prince Henry the Navigator invested this capital in a variety of new technologies to create far-flung networks of settlement colonies and fortified trading posts. The fortified trading posts, by the way, one of which you can see here, were called feitorías. Some also invested in overseas plantations in the eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean. Others invested in gold and slave trades in West Africa. Portuguese sailors gained confidence with every new experience and success. Portuguese merchants and sailors learned to navigate the complex currents and prevailing winds of the West African coast, and by 1430 had come upon the Azores and the Madeiras. These were uninhabited island chains in the eastern Atlantic. With incentives from the crown and investments from Italian merchants, Portuguese immediately colonized and farmed these islands. The Portuguese also sought to colonize the Canary Islands, which are a little bit south of the Madeiras. There, however, they found rugged volcanic islands inhabited by dozens of bands and chiefdoms descended from pre-Islamic Moroccan immigrants. The presence of these indigenous Canarians spurred a competition among a variety of European adventurers. Ultimately, it was actually Spanish nobles under Isabella and Ferdinand who won title to the islands. These would be, of course, Columbus's future sponsors. The largest group of native inhabitants of the Canary Islands were called the Wanchas to the Europeans, these tribes were almost entirely annihilated. A few survivors who managed to make it were enslaved and forced to work on sugar plantations. In many ways, the experience of these Canarians foretold the Iberian and European acts of their future exploration across the ocean. Indigenous peoples who stood in Europeans' ways counted for little or nothing if they did so. Now, the Portuguese were always seeking the gold that they could not find in these eastern Atlantic islands. In 1444, this desire for gold, plus the impetus of Prince Henry the Navigator, led the Portuguese to reach the mouth of the Senegal River in West Africa. There, they traded Arabian war horses for gold dust. Also, they traded occasionally for slaves. The victims of these 1440s raids and exchanges were the first Africans to be shipped en masse across Atlantic waters. Most ended up in the households and artisan workshops of Lisbon in Portugal. In the 1480s, Portuguese reconnaissance in the eastern Gulf of Guinea led to contacts with the Kingdom of Benin, which is the yellow mark on your map of Africa there. This also led to the settlement of the offshore islands of Príncipe and São Tomé. So this is Benin, and here is Equatorial Guinea, here is São Tomé, here is Príncipe. Some captives from Benin were forced to plant and refine sugar on São Tomé. Slave-staffed tropical sugar plantations here had their prototype off the coast of Central Africa in the years just before Columbus's famous voyages. Such plantations would eventually come to define the economy and culture of colonial Brazil and much of the Caribbean basin from the 15th through the 19th centuries. Iberians also developed similar plantations in the Canaries and on the Madeiras. By 1488, Bartolomé Dias rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama became the first European to reach India by sea. Portuguese enterprise therefore had momentum, cumulative knowledge, and so far, overall success. So, when Christopher Columbus proposed to the Portuguese king in the 1480s that they ought to open a westward route to what he called the Indies, he was actually declined by the Portuguese king. Columbus's calculations about that westward passage were doubted, and the Portuguese were successful enough in what they were doing, so no need was seen for an alternative route. By 1510, the Portuguese had used their sturdy ships and superior firepower to seize more than 12 ports lining the Indian Ocean from they'd seized them mostly from Muslim inhabitants. They had along the Indian Ocean and made it all the way to India itself. They wanted to dominate the existing maritime Asian trade, not to establish a colonial land empire. So as a result, the Portuguese and Spanish expansion, as we'll see, took a very different form.